Very quick one from James and then Will.
Thanks, Chair. No, not only did instruction come or permission be granted to spend the money that was given for transition on spending it on other things, that was permitted. You cite local government, local authorities. The LGA say that high needs funding faces a 1.6 billion black hole by 2021. So you're not funding them enough, and the money that you do give, you give them permission to spend elsewhere, and then we sit wondering how and why we are where we are. That's a series of mistakes, isn't it?
I think we have to be really accurate here, because the funding for high needs is ring-fenced. So that funding is not...
And a ring-fence shortfall of 1.6 billion, according to the LGA.
So, and you're right to challenge us on high needs.
Do you agree with
funding.
that figure?
We are looking in detail with the whole sector at what the funding challenge is, and we've got a spending review, and I will be making the case for further funding. We clearly have identified this as an issue, which is why we announced the 350 million, 250 of which is going into revenue, and then
half a bridge isn't a bridge, Minister, is it?
Well,
so saying here's a shortfall, we'll patch halfway. You're still falling. Still falling.
So you're right to identify funding as a challenge, but if I share with you our meeting yesterday with the SEND partners, they said actually yes, funding is a challenge, but let's put it aside. They want to talk about workforce, because workforce and workforce training really important, and leadership around it. They want to talk about specialist education and commissioning of that. These were really important areas. So it's not just about funding.
Will, can you comment on later?
Yeah, fine.
James.
I refer members to my register of interest. I'm founder of a careers education company. Good morning, Ministers and Andrew. 2 weeks ago, we challenged two local authorities about how they were operating the process of applications for EHCP assessments. Local authorities have needs assessment policies based on a restrictive criteria, not the statutory test. That's not right, is it?
So the Code of Practice encourages the local authorities to develop the criteria as guidelines to help them decide when it is necessary to carry out an EHC needs assessment, and following, of course, that assessment to decide whether you need an EHC plan or otherwise. However, what they must do is be prepared to depart from that criteria where there is compelling evidence for them to do so.
So envisage a scenario, because I think there is a real problem, and Timpson acknowledged it in the labelling issue. There's a real problem in the system about what is an application for an EHCP and the subsequent assessment, and what that assessment concludes in the plan. And the plan can be of varying forms. If at application criteria is being applied, that is inconsistent and unlawful in my interpretation of the guidance from the Department of Education. Do you agree?
If it's unlawful, of course I agree.
So I will just question the Minister, if I may, please. I'll gladly come on to you. But how then, at application stage, is an assessment being undertaken without an assessment of need?
So let's start with the process with a parent and a child, where the parent comes home from a medical appointment with a diagnosis. The first stage is working with the Senko at school to see what are the needs of that child. Now, that if those needs can be met, then I think you're in a good place. If they can't, then obviously the parents want to go further and have an assessment to see whether they need an EHC plan. That is the process. So
the local authorities we spoke to, 20% in one case, and I know it to be true of local authorities around the country, 20% of the applications were being refused. And so how can a judgment of a requirement of need be made without an assessment at application stage? And I compared it to any of us attending A&E and being judged by the receptionist and not the triage. And my point is, if you present, you should be assessed. The conclusion and the quality and the content of that plan is what is assessed, and by no means is it universal.
Yeah.
But for 20% of applications to be refused,
Yeah.
which is not a point of consideration. This is very often through a frame of struggle, through years of being in the system, through a SEND plan of some form not being up to scratch, and yet 20% are being refused. Where is the intervention from department level to cease that unlawful practice?
Well, so I think this area, which is why I described to you what happens with the SENCO and the support that can be put in place, is where parents, so in Portsmouth, I heard from the parent carer leader there, that lots of parents, now because of the relationship with the local authority and the school, are more confident that their child doesn't need an EAC plan. So they're not challenging the issue of why they because actually a trusted voice, another parent with a similar set of circumstances, saying to them, actually, this school can deliver for you, and you don't need.
I quite agree that will breed confidence.
But there are a number where I do agree with you, because we've still got 50,000 going to tribunal, where clearly we may not be getting this exactly right.
What's the national figure of tribunals being found in favour of the
I think it's
parent?
89%, but it's not just found. Because sometimes, actually, if you look at the detail of the tribunal, the tribunal will change the assessment, so it's not
sure.
It's not a cut and it's not a binary decision.
Sure, but I mean, there's a pretty high rate found in the favour of
I don't disagree
the applicant. And when actually you've a system that 96% that go through get a plan, there is a fear being adopted here, I think, by local authorities that, hold on, if we let them have an assessment, they will need a plan, and we can't afford that plan. And so how and which is why earlier questions I mentioned the black hole in the high needs funding. We are at risk, you are at risk of presiding over a system that in school language might be deemed as halfway there.
Yeah.
Keep going, a teacher might write on this legislation. 2014 legislation is a terrific piece, a commendable piece of intent.
Yeah.
And the Act itself puts in sharp focus the entitlements and the voice of the child. Yeah. But I put it to you that having raised those entitlements, the government has moved on to something else, walked away. Now, we are seeing this all too often, that there isn't their resource to match, and it isn't just funding, because as I've said in front of the Minister Gibb before, if actually there was an intervention from government to encourage local authorities to spend on SEND, the example you've just referred to in Portsmouth, then the confidence in the system would be bred upstream. But we know this to be true, and yet you are not doing anything about that intervention. It is in your gift to intervene in that, but there is no example of that intervention happening in a routine measure, whether it's on funding, whether it's on capacity, whether it's on the leadership issue and accountability that I think you're absolutely right to have cited in some of your answers. So when will that intervention come from this government on this issue?
So I think that you've identified all the right things. The slight unfairness is to say we're not doing anything about it. I actually think we are doing lots about this, whether it's on the funding, and yes, it's 350 million, it's 350 million, taking the budget to 6.3 billion. We've got an SR coming up on the issue around how do we learn from best practice. And the reason I go around the country and see schools like the Admiral Lord Nelson School in Portsmouth and see how they do this. How do you actually deliver this? And it's not, they're not doing it in a vacuum.
That's great, that's great. And I absolutely agree with you, but it isn't enough to sort of generation game style point at things in observation. What we need is a system transformation. And to just build on my colleague's excellent line of questioning before, on the examples of data and intelligence, positive outcomes for children, young people and their families, according to your measuring success of the SEND system, as a measure of success, destination after Key Stage 4 and 5, huge discrepancy, but no benchmark to compare it to. I suspect it's not going to improve by having the benchmark, but please, I look forward to those figures. School absence and exclusion rates. We know from Timpson that all excluded pupils, of all of them rather, 70% are SEND, and that's a rising That's a rising figure. So by your own criteria, this is a failure and half a job. The Act was great, but you've not done anything to cement it, to systematically implement it.
So you just said it yourself, right? By Timpson, right? By the figure's not 70, 78% that are excluded are SEND children. But you said it yourself when you cite things like Timpson, is that we're challenging ourselves all the time to do better, to go further, to learn from best practice. This is really difficult stuff to deliver on the ground.
I put it to you that Timpson was instigated because of the race disparity audit from the Prime Minister. It subsequently had a whole host of other stuff put into it, including the exclusions. I also put it to you that the delay in reporting was because of this emergent pattern around SEND featuring so prominently within exclusion figures. Please.
This point. So what Timpson identified was that after identifying for other factors of deprivation and so on, for a given SEN category, students with an EHCP plan or a statement were typically less likely to be permanently excluded than non-SEN children. However, those that do have SEN but do not have an EHCP plan were generally more likely to be permanently excluded. And then when you go through some of the categories of special educational needs, so for example, children with severe learning difficulty or a physical disability or profound and multiple learning difficulties, they were less likely to be excluded than the average.
And I would say in some respects there's some encouragement to that, because the minute we label and direct resource, appropriate resource, not just funding but leadership and capacity and expertise, and actually celebrating the term special, in every other walk of life special means something different to the experiences for many kids with special educational needs in this system, because actually if we identify SEND in mainstream better and appoint resources to that, the requirement for EHCPs, which has gone up because it becomes a magnet. Parents think, well, actually the Shangri-La and all of this is the pursuit of an EHCP because they're being failed at SEND mainstream level. So if we correct that balance, we'll start to turn the thing around. But I hear nothing of how that is happening. We've got high needs funding, black hole or shortfall, the transition money being spent elsewhere, tribunals going through the roof, found in favour of the parent and the child, not of the system.
Can I just come in on the funding issue you talk about? We do understand the pressures on the high needs budget. We have increased it since 2013 by £1 billion. So it's now 6.3 billion. So in just a few years, it's gone up by £1 billion. And the Secretary of State particularly understands this pressure, and that's why we used available headroom money in December. We allocated that headroom funding, not to the school system as a whole, but to special needs particularly. £125 million in the last financial year and £125 million in this financial year, plus an extra £100 million capital to try and improve and increase the number of special units in mainstream schools or special schools. So, and we do understand, going into the next spending review, and we're working extremely hard in the department in preparing for that spending review. The absolute priority, there are two key priorities for that spending review. One is post-16 funding, an issue for another discussion.
Okay, thank you.
And secondly, special and high needs funding. They are key priorities. We understand the pressure. And the other thing that's happening, Nadine mentioned the fact that local authorities can transfer up to 0.5% from the schools block into the high needs block funding, provided they have permission from the schools forum. But if they go above that, they have to ask permission of the Secretary of State, a disapplication. We are receiving a large number of disapplication requests from local authorities to move 0.5% or slightly more than 0.5% from schools to high needs. So we absolutely understand the detail of the pressures that every local authority is under, and that's why that will feed into the spending.
We've got to get
Very
Just continuing the challenge about it only half a job on the Act. The Act, of course, extended the right to EHCPs to 25, age 25, but the department chose not to fund it. Is this a costly mistake, and do you see the impact across the sector for such a decision?
I thought we we did provide additional funding at the time for the extension, which I think was 252 million.
The transition fund?
I'll write to you with the exact figure.
Okay. So do you see that the impact of, if that transition fund was essentially discretionary, the impact then of that not being applied? And I think probably the question means, or my reference to the question is to suggest that the proportion of funding for transition wasn't extended by the same level of extension of age, essentially proportionate to that. Would you agree?
Well, I certainly think some of the funding pressures have come from us going further to 25. That's undeniable, and it's what we're looking at for spending.
Also, learning difficulty assessments, which went on beyond 19, did include young people with SEN and were funded. So that funding was already, some of that funding was already in the system through the LDA process.
Right, okay. Can you expand a bit on that?
Well, young people with LDAs were not part of the statementing system. So local authorities did have funding for LDA placements in independent sector, for example. So when that group, the LDAs finished in 2016 and those young people became entitled to education, health and care plans, the funding that was attached to the LDA process became part of the high needs block. So it's not everyone who's now 19 to 25, it's not brand new population. Some of it will have been there through the LDA process. So there's always been some 19 to 25-year-olds who have received funding through education departments.
And was the estimation equal to the numbers in post-19?
Well, that's something we're going to come back to you on.
You're going to come back to us on that?
So in terms of the 252 million that the Minister mentioned.
Okay. A report issued by the Education Policy Institute last week gives some colour to the extension and the estimation of that impact of extension to then what the impact was. So, for example, in 2017, 3,256 new EHCPs were created for young people post-16, compared to 262 new plans for the same age group in 2014. So the estimation, that sort of half a job point, is that, again, actually, to be commended that we extend the entitlement, that we recognise the additional requirement and the attention level to those students and young people, young adults, but then a kind of dereliction of that duty by not then supporting it with appropriate resources. And that's a huge leap, isn't it, from 262 to 3,256.
We've been told time and time again, I could quote you for the next 2 hours from our evidence, saying that it's confused, post-90 is confused, inconsistent and not funded properly.
It's a real, the post-19 area is really very complex and probably touches upon the challenges of the three agencies and the various legislations that apply to health, social care and education for those above 19. So it really is testing lots of very complex issues. So it is challenging and it does need greater clarification. One of the opportunities we have coming up is the revision to the Code of Practice. But it does need a lot of work to bring together the various agencies and their responsibilities and the level of support and provision they're making.
Because I absolutely celebrate your ability to refer to good practice, and you've a role to evangelise with that good practice. But can I ask that you ask your department to take you to the places that are failing, and that you spend time there and understand that, because just in the job, in our job is not just to find the failings, but to extol the virtues of what works and the success. I'll just finish my comment, if I may, because I think the success of this is your ability to articulate what is failing, not what is working. Because just in the same way you celebrate identification being a really important thing, it is only half the job. Identifying and then resolving is the full job. And I think, I really encourage, because it's a cross-party effort, this.
Yes.
I think we're all believers in what's needed.
Yep.
But I would just ask that you're...
You just say point well made, not pass.
I think point very well made. All I would say, a tiny intervention, is to say, of course, I look at where failure is at all the time.
Okay, got it.
Social media is full of it,
I
but actually the positives never get
Got it.
much
Ian,
hearing.
Ian.